Now, in regards to the Chapter 5 introduction section or heading of the chapter, this is one of the most underdeveloped areas in an entire dissertation. And I think what happens is once the student is working to produce all the implications and findings and recommendations, it's almost like an afterthought to go back and write the introduction and conclusion. Because many believe, who the heck's going to read that? That more than likely nobody's going to read the introduction and conclusion, and I would suggest to you that's false. The introduction may be the only thing that somebody reads in your dissertation. You say, well, how is that? It's because oftentimes people are going to look to your chapter 5 first. They're not going to read it from the beginning to the end. Some people may look in chapter 2, some people may look in chapter 4 to see your data, but a lot of people are going to go straight to chapter 5. And what they're going to see first in chapter 5 is your introduction. If your introduction is lackluster or it's not complete, they may never go beyond that. And I think that would be a shame because you put a lot of time and effort into your dissertation. This should be like the introduction chapter 1 is to your entire study, where it helps to create some sort of excitement, helps the reader understand the value of what they're going to be reading because you've produced something that's significant and substantial, and they need to know what you have. Readers may not have read the entire dissertation, as I mentioned. They may not have read anything else to this point. And so therefore, you have to make sure chapter 5 is a standalone chapter. I always tell students to make sure every individual chapter is a standalone document. For that purpose, that if a reader only looks at one chapter, every introduction to every chapter has enough information to help entice the reader to want to read more. Make this section of chapter 5 as dynamic as possible. Don't just go about it haphazardly and say, well, in this chapter there's going to be some implications, some findings, and conclusions. Help to create positive flow, positive energy, to let the reader know that there's some implications that no other study has produced before, that some of the recommendations that you have in your study are things that people need to read and they need to know about to help lessen the problem. If you're going to be able to extend the body of knowledge or close the gap in the literature, be positive about that. Be excited about that, that your study produced some new knowledge that's going to help people. But if you just say, well, in this chapter you're going to find some implications that, grounded in the data, and some of the conclusions, some people are going to be able to use. There's a difference there. And I think you need to be able to understand how to write this introduction section to really bring value to your work. You want to look to attract the reader's attention. How many dissertations have you looked at already? How many chapter 5s have you read while you're preparing to do your work? Did you notice that some of them, you just didn't really feel very positive about, that you really couldn't care whether you looked at it or not? Then think about the ones that attracted your attention. What was in there? Now, you don't need any figures or tables, but it's usually the language which the author has provided. It's something that makes you look forward to wanting to get into the rest of the chapter. Think about a trailer to a movie that you see on TV. You see maybe, 30 or 60 seconds of the whole movie. But it's that trailer which pulls people into the theater and the audiences and creates excitement. How can you do that with your work? All you have to do is spend a little time and think about it. And I always tell my mentees, once you're done and you're getting ready to write this introduction and the conclusion section to chapter 5, just put your dissertation down. Go sit in a comfortable chair. Now think about the entire value of what you've done for the last couple of years. How did you start out? What came to be? And what was that aha moment, or what was that one thing in your research you found that you didn't expect? That's what needs to go into introduction. That needs to be included in there with your excitement and the knowledge that what you produced is significant. This is what I suggest for the introduction. 2 to 4 paragraphs. Don't just put one paragraph that, the purpose of the study, was to do this. You had 2 research questions and, following in this chapter is the implications, conclusions, and findings. That's not enough. Put in there 2 to 4 paragraphs. That means you're going to have maybe 1.5 to 2.5 pages just for the introduction. Most dissertations don't do this well, and there may be 1 or 2 paragraphs. My recommendation have, if you're going to have 2 paragraphs, then real quickly get into the meat, the salient points of the other chapters. Then the second paragraph would be, what is remaining in the dissertation in chapter 5. But I think 3 paragraphs are ideal. These are going to be that salient points from the other chapters. You're going to include the salient points. And what are the salient points? And that comes to think about all the questions that people have asked you for the last couple of years. What's the problem? What's the purpose of your study? What are your research questions? What did you end up getting out of your study? That's what people want to know. That's the salient points of a dissertation. Those are the things you want to mention. You don't have to go in detail about, if there was 8,000 people in the survey population and, your survey participants, after you did a fair, assessment, they determined what's a fair share sample, that you ended up with 310 people. Out of 310 people, you got 270 surveys. You don't need to go to that level of detail here. The salient points, perhaps how many were in your survey population, how many participants did you get, what was the value, what was the basic meaning of the outcome of your work. Then, of course, what follows in the chapter. And I don't think it's enough just to say, well, in this chapter, you're going to find, this wash list of items. Here's the implications. There's going to be some conclusions. There's going to be, a couple of this and a couple of that. Give it some explanation. Indicate, perhaps, what is the most important implication. What's the number one recommendation? What was the one thing that was found that wasn't expected? That's what follows in the chapter. It's not just that wash list of headings. Now here, Dr. Ellen Beatty, who was one of my mentees, and she graduated in 2012. Her dissertation is titled A Quantitative Correlation Study, Institutional Characteristics and Endowment Investment Performance Following the 2008-2009 Financial Crisis. This is how she wrote her introduction to Chapter 5. Chapter 5 includes a review of the research questions and interview questions, review of the problem and purpose, summary of the findings, thematically the recommendations, and summary and conclusions. The purpose of this phenomenological study was to gain an understanding of the perceptions of high school graduates regarding their own college readiness, exploring perceptions from students' perspectives. The central research question used in this study was designed to explore the themes associated with college student success. What are the perceptions of college students about their own lived experiences in high school that may have helped them prepare for college? In addition, the focus of the interview questions was the students' perception of their success. Just in this one paragraph, in a few sentences, you get a pretty good view of what's in Chapter 5. She went on in the next paragraph to indicate 20 participants returned the consent form for the survey. Interview questions were sent to 20 participants, and 17 responded within the time constraints of the study. The study was open for 7 weeks. Responses to question number 1 were similar throughout the collection period. It possibly that the snowball technique used to recruit participants affected the results of the study. Due to time limitations of the study and 100% saturation of the AP responses for question number 1, the 17 responses were considered adequate for the study, and the study was closed. So right here you get a sense that she did hit data saturation, how many people were in the study, how many responded. Additionally, she said, or wrote as the case may be, the interviews included 3 questions initially. First, what positive academic experiences do you remember? Second, academically, how prepared do you believe you were for the rigors of college? Third, academically, what do you know now that you wish you had known in high school regarding college? And then she goes on to say additional sub-questions were used to allow participants to provide more detail where needed. Transcripts of all the interviews are available in Appendix G. And because she put all the transcripts in Appendix G, she had a couple extra 100 pages of transcripts. And that's great. You don't want to include any of that real details in Chapter 5. Definitely not in the introduction section. The purpose of this phenomenological study was to gain an understanding of the perceptions of high school graduates regarding their own college readiness. The participants successfully shared what positive perceptions they felt made the college curriculum more attainable for them. The AP courses were mentioned by 100% of the participants. These students in the study could avoid remediation classes. Students who take remediation courses are less likely to graduate with college diploma. She gives a citation or 2 here. Consequently, secondary programs should provide adequate training for graduates to enable them to meet the expectations of higher education academia. Secondary schools are offering a diploma that does not denote that the student is ready for college, but rather that the students complete a secondary level work. This disconnect in the standards and expectations must be addressed. So you get a sense from what she put in her introduction. Notice it's a couple paragraphs long, right? It's not just one quick paragraph. It's quite informative. It also really has a summary that's involved with this of the entire dissertation, and that's fine. Now I'm going to give you some information about Chapter 5, the conclusion paragraph to your dissertation. Things to think about as you're deciding what to put in this conclusion, how to write it, basically how to design it for flow. First thing, I suggest, now this should be 2 to 3 paragraphs. The other one, as far as the introduction, I said 2 to 4. I suggest that the conclusion be 1 paragraph shorter than the introduction. The introduction should be a little bit longer, but the conclusion is just to wrap up the chapter and, if you haven't already, close the loop. This area is also one of the most underdeveloped sections in the entire study, and I do not understand this. This is the last thing a reader might read of your work. Why would you underdevelop it? If nothing else, you might just want to make this the best paragraph in the chapter. Because if other people like me go straight to the end, they may never read anything else unless this section in your chapter 5 is written in such a manner that it draws the person's attention to want to go read more. There's a lot of people like me who like to read what's at the end first. Even when I read the Bible, I read the last chapter first. I want to know what happened at the end, right? It's just the way I am. I do the same thing when I open up dissertations or research reports. I don't usually have time, nor do I want to read the whole study. I'll go to chapter 5 if it's a dissertation. I'll get to the end, and then I'll decide from there, do I want to read more? So you want to make sure that you put time and effort into this final section or heading of your dissertation. If you haven't already, close that loop. What I mean by closing the loop is provided in one of the other lessons in this lesson plan for Chapter 5. But if you haven't done it already in Chapter 5, you want to end your conclusion with information that suggests how the data produced information, how that information produced meaning that allowed you to answer the research questions, and how answering those research questions produced something that people could potentially use to lessen the problem that you studied. Oftentimes, students will not have a separate section for closing the loop, but they'll do it in the conclusion. And I can tell you from my experience that the majority of the dissertations I've read the first time from a student, whether as a committee member or when I review dissertations from the university perspective, does not close the loop. And their conclusion doesn't even have something to this effect. Now, my mentees do because I tell them early on to make sure that they include this. Please make sure you include something about closing that loop, if not a separate section before the conclusion, then in the conclusion. If somebody only reads this heading, what would you want them to know? Think again of that 29-second elevator pitch. If somebody came up to you, let's just say it's a dean of your university or the president of your university at your graduation, you just got your degree, you've got your tassel turned to the left side of your hat, you're now Dr. whoever your last name is, and the president of the university says, what was your dissertation about? Well, you don't have time to go into some long drawn out, well, I had these 3 research questions and I wrote 30 pages on the literature review and, I did this kind of study and, I had these kind of questions, these interview questions. You got to get to it quickly. And that's the value of your conclusion. You should basically script this out so that if you only had a few minutes at the most, that you'd be able to share this information. In most cases, you should be able to tell a reader what your dissertation was about in what I call this 29 seconds. There's 2 to 3 paragraphs that's very succinct. It's purposeful. It's designed in a manner that has these positive words that allows your content to flow well and articulate exactly what the value was of your work. Now, Dr. Ellen Beatty in her dissertation with her conclusion and the quantitative correlation study of the institutional characteristics endowment investment performance following the 2008 and 2009 financial crisis concluded her dissertation with this information. 4 recommendations were made. The first, secondary schools should provide more opportunities for high school students to take AP classes. Second, restructuring the current class curriculum in all classes outside the AP program to match what the APA program uses. Third, secondary schools should support hiring, training, retain highly qualified teachers whose students believe are accessible, reliable, and rigorous in both their curriculum and their commitment to the students. Fourth, find more ways to strengthen student motivation. Notice how this paragraph starts right off and gives the reader what the recommendations were, because that's the most important part of her study. Then she goes on to say, based on the recommendations for leadership, one area of further study should include more research on motivation. Building that motivation may need to include community, schools, and parents. Another area for the next study would be to expand the interview to include more community college participants. Third, future studies may be able to use other social networking sites that provide more face-to-face interaction, such as Google Plus or Hangout. Last, this study could be expanded to include populations of other schools in California. As part of the reflective summary, what I just want to share with you is the importance of the introduction of your Chapter 5 is to purely understand that it should be power, have this power within it with these actionable words that really draws the reader into your work, not just lets them go. A lot of times people look at Chapter 5 as, let's give them the information, let's let them go, let's get the chapter over with. I think that's wrong. Pull them into your study. Make them want to ask about more. Let them want to read more. Get them curious about what's in your work. I shared an example of introduction, how one of my students did that. And then I shared some information again about the conclusion of your chapter, and I gave an example about that. Keep in mind, as you work on your introduction and conclusion, make sure that they're representative of the significance and substantial outcome of your work. If you don't, nobody else will. This is where you get the chance as you get into Chapter 5, and particularly as you conclude your chapter and your dissertation, to let the reader know with some level of excitement how proud you are of your work. There's nothing wrong with indicating that the one thing that was learned that was not expected was whatever it is, or that the body of knowledge, the gap was lessened because of the recommendation that was found in the data that you found. Nothing wrong with that. Unfortunately, not enough students do that, and therefore, at the end, somebody reads a dissertation, say, yeah, it was a good study, but it could have been better. I do believe, in general, that, don't underestimate the value of the introduction and conclusion content in Chapter 5. Too many people do. And I believe that is why a lot of people don't like to read dissertations. They say they're dry. They say they're hard to read. Well, that's because people who write them so that they're dry. They write them so they're not exciting. If you write your work to be exciting and with a positive flow to it, people are going to want to read your work. I can tell you the reason why one of my mentees, Dr. Joseph Hagee, won the Dissertation of the Year award a couple years ago for his quantitative study was because he used the right terminology. He provided everything to a nice level of breadth and depth, and he made the reader interested in what was in that dissertation. And it was one of the longest dissertations one of my mentees ever produced. But if you read it, it'd be like a good book. You just kind of go right through it, and you wonder, where'd the last couple hours go? I wish you great success in finalizing your dissertation. This is a great time to be excited. Let the passion that started you in your program and kept you going through all these years throughout your classes and your proposal and dissertation work to shine in your final chapter. Let your committee members be proud of the work that they're approving, and your university to want to display your work as a best practice for others.